Modern attitudes toward prisons and prisoners are analogous to those ancient misconceptions and expectations, which explains why prison abolition faces a protracted and difficult battle in the United States. After all, politicians need for the voters to feed the prison complex, and to keep that happening, prisons must remain at capacity. Nativist sentiment in the United States has always been robust, illustrated primarily by an overt hostility toward immigrants. According to British historian Tony Judd, where immigration and visible minorities have altered the demography of a country, we typically find the increased suspicion of others. The reaction includes designating English as the country's official language. There are cities in America, such as Nashville and Miami, and states, Oklahoma for example, that have taken the additional step of mandating that all government business be transacted in English. This contrasts sharply with, for example, Canada's Official Languages Act of 1969, which recognized the rights of both French and English-speaking citizens to converse in the language they prefer. Vigorous debates continue to erupt regarding the rights of immigrants to health care and restrictions on school attendance for their children. Those debates have spawned a form of vigilantism in which armed patrols of citizen volunteers monitor the border between Mexico and the United States, intercepting and detaining anyone suspected of attempting to enter the country illegally. Given this toxic brew of xenophobia and tribalism, it follows that anyone designated as outside the cultural mainstream, including the current President of the United States, generates suspicion and frequent derision. Carried to the extreme, men and women whose behavior violates the law find themselves classified as subhuman, denied fundamental rights, and declared undeserving of humanitarian consideration. A litany of horrors. In order to justify the mass imprisonment of its citizens, a government must convince the public of the necessity for such extreme measures, and a powerful political-economic alliance in the United States has been able to realize that goal with remarkably little resistance. All that's necessary is to publicize a vicious crime, offer tendentious inductive rationale that an isolated case of brutality indicates a general breakdown of law and order, and co-opt the electorate into supporting longer sentences in more prisons. It's this uncertainty elevated to the level of insecurity and collective fear that is the most corrosive force threatening today's abolitionist agenda. In New Hampshire, where we live, the state recently convicted Michael Addison for the murder of Manchester police officer Michael Briggs. Addison was portrayed as the quintessential urban predator, guilty of multiple prior felonies with no redeeming social value. This contrasted sharply with Briggs's exemplary life as a dedicated policeman, husband, and father. Indeed, in a supreme bit of irony, Briggs had previously saved Addison's life after Addison had been shot. The outrage following the murder persisted to the penalty phase of Addison's trial, after which the jury imposed the sentence of death. New Hampshire had not executed anyone since 1939, but Addison became the poster child for the resumption of capital punishment through the government's success in identifying him as unworthy of continued existence, not just in the community, but in the world. More recently, 4 men broke into a residential New Hampshire home where a young mother and her 14-year-old daughter were sleeping. 2 of the men attacked the sleeping residents with knives and a machete, killing the mother and seriously wounding the daughter before fleeing with a small amount of money and property. The sheer brutality and callous nature of the event provoked an immediate call in the state's legislature to expand the classification of crimes for which perpetrators would be eligible for the death penalty. Violent crimes alone are not the sine qua non that drives calls for more prisons and longer sentences. Whether it was the Enron scandal or Madoff, when people feel as though they've been affronted, they scream for the only thing they know, revenge, and as it stands, prison is the only revenge available. Perhaps we should consider that fact. Civic reaction, judicial retribution. During the recent global recession, men and women struggling to meet financial obligations and feed their families had little patience with apparently soulless predators who would rob them of their fortunes and their lives. Politicians consistently responded to this fear and loathing by passing even more invasive laws and increasing the punishments for existing ones. The media continue their collusion by adhering to the time-honored precept, if it bleeds, it leads. That is, newspaper and television reporters are encouraged to give primacy to stories designed to appeal to the most prurient interests, clamoring to interview victims or survivors with an emphasis on wringing every ounce of emotional possible from the reporting. The response is predictable. In a recent poll by the newspaper USA Today, 2009, 49% of the respondents thought that the death penalty in the United States was not applied enough. Another 24% said that it was applied adequately, while only 20% believed that the frequency should be reduced. Obviously, abolitionist arguments have enormous philosophical obstacles to overcome in a country in which 73% of the population thinks it's acceptable for the government to kill its citizens. These statistics, however, provide only a narrow window into the rebarbative theories that underlie them. It wasn't until 1988, for example, that the Supreme Court of the U.S. barred the execution of defendants who were under the age of 16 when they committed their offenses. The same court subsequently held that the Constitution does not prohibit the execution of convicted persons who were 16 or 17 years old at the time of the crime, as if the emotional maturity and psychological development of a 10th grader were superior to that of a 9th grader. Adding insult to injury, the court has also authorized executions of mentally challenged defendants and held that indigent death row inmates do not have the right to counsel in state courts during appeals of their death sentences. Court observers should not indulge in an optimistic predictions following the most recent decision in which the majority finally ruled that executing teenagers under 18 violated constitutional norms. That decision was also 5-4, and the 4 justices voting to execute high school students remain on the court. The dragons identified. In the United States, the fear and resentment generated by crime is disproportionately directed at those defendants who do not like or sound like the majority. And that majority, shrinking as we write, is white. David Cole's recent analysis of America's prisons describes the fallout. The biggest challenge is that the very demographics that made the pattern of crime and punishment in America so skewed against blacks and Latinos also makes it all too easy for politicians and the majorities they represent to adhere to an unthinking, tough-on-crime attitude. The tradition is hardly new. The racial component of crime and punishment has a long and sordid history in America. The backstory to today's startling incarceration rates includes 250 years of enslavement of black Africans and their descendants, the forcible confinement of Native American peoples to reservations, and mass imprisonment of Japanese Americans during the Second World War. In a grim perpetuation of the same pattern, most male prisoners in the United States prisons today are poor and members of minority groups. Nearly half are African Americans, while Hispanics comprise about 18% of that population. Limited education is a contributing problem, with 49% of prisoners are incarcerated without having earned either a high school diploma or a GED. For most observers, these depressing statistics, betraying as they do a systemic bias against the culturally defined other, would beg for immediate action to redress the obvious discrimination. Sadly, even faced with proof of the discrimination, the courts persist in pointing out those frontiers where dragons continue to lurk in order to justify capturing and killing them.